listening to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network, the nonprofit organization that strives to address the staggering disparity in resource availability for individuals suffering from mental health disorders, processing disorders, addictions, trauma healing, and sexual identity challenges. Together, we strive to end the stigma associated with these challenges so that true healing can begin. Welcome back to Coffee and Conversation with Recovery Advocate Network. I'm your host, Ange, and I welcome you to episode number 13. Today, we have Crissy Clark, the Clinical Director of Ripple Ranch Recovery, located in Spring Branch, Texas, to discuss the link between childhood trauma and addiction. We will walk through common types of childhood traumas, the role of coping mechanisms in the onset of addiction, and how therapy can address and heal past traumas. Since this episode deals with addiction, sexual trauma, complex PTSD, self-harm, suicidal ideations, and other sensitive topics, we want to remind you that if you feel triggered, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're in the United States and are in need of other resources such as shelter, support group resources, transportation, food, and/or a safe, confidential path out of physical and/or emotional domestic abuse, call 211 or visit www.211info.org for assistance. So, what are we waiting for? Fill up your coffee and let's get started. Good afternoon, listeners. I am very excited today to have Crissy Clark with us from Ripple Ranch, and she is going to talk about a topic that is near and dear to my life and my history, the tie between trauma and addiction. So, Crissy, why don't you introduce yourself and tell us why you're here today?
Great. I am Crissy Clark. I'm the Executive Director of Ripple Ranch Recovery, which is an inpatient treatment center for people with substance use and mental health in Spring Branch, Texas. We also have Continuum, which is our PHP and IOP, which is in San Antonio near UTSA. And we're just about to start a new adolescent program, IOP, at the same location. Started out as the clinical director of Ripple Ranch, and then we've expanded in the 2.5 years since I've been there.
And I will remind listeners, if they've heard some of the previous episodes, and listeners, if you haven't heard some of the previous episodes, check out especially episode 10, where we interviewed Joshua, and he talked about treatment at Blue Ridge and at Alana. But PHP is partial hospitalization, and IOP is an intensive outpatient, and they're just different levels of care based on the level of treatment that you need. Go for it.
Okay. Yeah. And we actually have several levels of care because we start off with detox at Ripple Ranch. So we have our detox, which is overseen by our medical staff. It's 24-hour medical staff. And then we have residential treatment. Then we can step them down to the partial hospitalization and the intensive outpatient. And then we also offer some general outpatient. So those are kind of the different levels of care that we offer. I am here obviously to talk about trauma and addiction. And I think throw in probably mental health in there because I think one of my themes is that I don't really distinguish all that much between substance use and mental health. I kind of feel like they are one and the same. And we do take mental health primary clients or substance use primary, and of course, dual diagnosis and co-occurring. That's why I'm here.
Where should we start? I think one of the things that we are passionate about with RAN is reducing the stigma, trying to educate. I would say education on different planes. So education in the addict. So I found it very healing myself when I started understanding, for example, when I was in treatment and reading books such as The Body Keeps the Score, understanding, okay, of course I have these behaviors because I experienced a severe childhood trauma. As a consequence of that, these are the behaviors that I learned seemed like great coping mechanisms. And then later in life, when I use them, they are not great coping mechanisms. How do we educate the addict that is how these developed? And so healing begins by understanding that and learning new coping mechanisms. And then also, Rand is passionate about the education of family members and of the community to be able to understand that the addict needs to learn these healing mechanisms and also reduce that blame and stigma in the community. So I think, what are the mechanisms that Ripple Ranch that you use when you have clients come in, when you work with family members? What does that dynamic or that theology look like at your center?
And I love that you mentioned Body Keeps the Score, because that is absolutely one of my favorite books. One of the things that Bessel Kolk mentions in that book is that just knowing what trauma does to us doesn't help us heal the trauma. We know that awareness is the first step in change, but there's all these other steps that have to come after that, right? As far as educating clients, the clients are given a kind of wide variety of exposure to different modalities. One of the things that I think makes Ripple Ranch unique and that I think is really important for people in recovery is that we offer a variety of recovery meetings. So while we do AA and we promote AA because we know that that works for a lot of people, we also know that it doesn't work for everybody. So our clients also get to do SMART recovery. They get to do Dharma recovery. They get exposure to different recovery meetings so that then when they leave us, they can kind of know what works for them. So I think it's really important for people to stay open to different types of recovery. Like it doesn't have to necessarily be AA. So that works really well for us. We also understand that there are some people that need medicated assisted treatment. We offer MAT, and medications do work really well for some people. And then we also have a lot of holistic treatments, which I think is Body Keeps the Score. He talks a lot about yoga. I have so many people that have had trauma that I'm always interested what worked for you in your recovery. And so many people say yoga. I have people say, you're going to think this is so stupid, but it's yoga. We just know that when you've been through a lot of trauma, you have to first kind of calm your central nervous system before you can access that prefrontal cortex and start learning new coping skills. So when our clients come in and they say, oh, I can't do yoga, I'm like, oh, that just tells me that you need yoga probably more than most people here, because you need to be able to sit and notice your thoughts and notice your breath and calm your central nervous system down and slow your heartbeat down before you can start the other stuff. So we do a lot of Reiki, we do Tai Chi, we do yoga, we do a lot of mindfulness. On top of that, we have like the evidence-based treatments. One of my big passions is EMDR. I try to get all of my therapists EMDR trained. We do CBT, we do DBT, a lot of the go-to therapies for trauma. And I think that one of the things that I always hope that clients take away from Ripple Ranch is that substance use and some mental health, issues are avoidance coping skills. And that's something that a lot of times we learn when we're young and we're in these traumatic situations or experiencing trauma. And sometimes avoidance keeps us going. We have to kind of box it up and compartmentalize our life to be able to keep going to school or keep taking care of our siblings or whatever we have to do in those moments. But like you said, a lot of times as you go through life, keeping that locked away takes a lot of energy and doesn't work so well long term. I think the biggest thing for the clients is understanding that this is a coping skill gone wrong, right? Using substances is a way to avoid feeling your feelings. And we're in it, like we're enmeshed in the trauma and we see it all the time. But we still have people come and say, no, I don't have any trauma. And then as you're talking to them, you find out that their grandparents raised them. Well, where were your parents? Well, my parents were abusive and they used substances. So I got adopted when I was 1. And it's like, but they don't connect that as a trauma. So making the link between the substance use and the trauma and just all of the symptoms is really important, I think, for our clients. As far as the families go, we offer a lot of psychoeducation for the families. Unfortunately, the family involvement got a little bit derailed during COVID when we were limiting people coming in, but we set up remote meetings. So we do that every week for the families, just so they can learn some of the same things that the clients are learning and support them in that. We keep the families updated. Obviously, family involvement is really important. I myself had a child that struggled with substance use, and she unfortunately was at a very vulnerable age when I went through a divorce. And so that was really traumatic for her. And so I know how that feels to be the family member and be just kind of lost and not knowing, how to help her and what my resources were. And I think that's one of the reasons I have such a passion for it, is because I know how hard that road can be. The family involvement is really important, and educating families on how they can help and what their resources are, I think is really important.
I think that's so important. I have been reading a couple of books by Catherine Gray, and I have recommended them to so many of my friends. And one of them is Sunshine, Warm, Sober, which is her second book. Phenomenal book. And her first book was The Unexpected Joy of Being Sober. And she talks about her journey of becoming sober. And in Sunshine, Warm, Sober, which is her play on words versus Stone Cold Sober. So she talks about these experiences of stone cold drunk, how I behaved when I was stone cold drunk. Like when I went to a concert and I was stone cold drunk, this was my experience, versus when I went to a concert and I was sunshine, warm, sober, this was my experience. So both those books and Catherine Gray, they're phenomenal. I highly recommend them. Listeners, I will put links to a lot of these things, including the acronyms that Crissy's been using, such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR, all of these in the show notes so that you have them. I will also reference, I love the yoga, tying back to those somatic touching and the healing part of it. Maddie in episode 9, who talked about her healing from sexual trauma, talked about the value of yoga in her healing experience. But going back to the number of individuals who enter treatment that have addiction challenges and say, I have no trauma, which I experienced when I went into treatment. I knew I had childhood trauma and I had just experienced a kidnapping. So I also knew I had adult trauma, right? So it was really obvious. And I was there with a lot of other individuals who were like, no, I had this perfect childhood. And Catherine Gray, in one of these 2 books, I believe it's in Sunshine, Warm, Sober, she talked about thinking that she didn't have any. And then when in therapy, she suddenly realized how much of when she started healing from her childhood trauma, how much it became easier and easier for her to stay sober. And she started learning about her ACE score, which is the Adverse Childhood Experiences. So if you go to the NIH, individuals with ACE scores that are over 5 are 7 to 10 times more likely to report illicit drug addiction compared to those that have lower ACE scores. So listeners, you can go online and take this test and ask questions such as, did you live in a home with someone who is addicted? Did you live in a home with domestic violence? There are a whole series of questions. I actually meant to go in and do my quiz. Maybe sometime during this podcast, I'll go through and do it. I have a really high ACE score. And so that was another thing too, is that when I was in treatment and I was reading the book Body Keeps Score, and I was like, of course I would have like eating disorders and all these challenges. And then I did my ACE score and I was like, holy smokes, of course I would. But I'm
Mm-hmm.
tying to that because Catherine Gray said she also just thought she had a fine childhood. And then when she went and really started doing therapy and healing from her childhood, that's when she really was able to gain the full joys of being sober and healing.
It's so important. We do the ACE assessment with our clients in one of our groups, in our trauma group. And we often have tears in that group because they don't realize they have trauma until they take that ACE assessment and understand how much trauma that they actually experienced. There's a really good video, a YouTube video by Dr. Nadine Burke, and she talks about how she discovered the ACE assessment and how they used it to look at kids that were presenting with diagnosis of ADHD. And it's one of the really common misdiagnoses is kids that are being diagnosed with ADHD are actually having trauma and trauma response. So that's another thing that we talk about in groups. Sometimes I'll have people raise their hand if they were ever diagnosed with ADHD. And so many of our clients were diagnosed with that when they were young, but it was actually just they were operating in survival mode. It looks very similar, but her video is really interesting, just all of the different health implications connected with trauma.
So if you were going to talk to someone and point out some common coping mechanisms that you see in or reactions that you see in individuals that you and your level of expertise and, being non-biased third-party observer might see this reaction or this behavior, and you might say, okay, I need to dig a little deeper with this individual into their childhood. Are there certain behaviors that kind of stand out that listeners might, maybe if you could share some of those that might help listeners maybe ponder, oh, I don't think I have any childhood trauma, but they may hear some of the things that you say that might encourage them to perhaps talk to their therapist or their loved ones, or maybe do an ACE test or something to delve a little deeper to try and explore that healing path for themselves.
A lot of it is kind of the DSM criteria for PTSD are the things that I would look for. And a lot of times they're, like I said, they're misdiagnosed and attributed to other diagnoses, but things like being easily triggered, so everywhere I go, I feel sort of am overstimulated, or things trigger me to have like a panic attack or, anxiety. People that say they're scared to go to the grocery store. They don't like going to the grocery store. That's like a very common thing for people with PTSD. I don't know why it is the grocery store. Maybe they can go to Target, but they can't. I literally had a client tell me the other day that they were fine going to Target, but they can't go to the grocery store. So I don't know what it is about the grocery store.
That is fascinating. I was just talking to my executive assistant, telling her I hate to grocery shop, but I hate to grocery shop. And my daughter loves to grocery shop. So my daughter would go and do all the grocery shopping and whatever. She goes through all of the aisles, but I hate it and never thought of that being tied to that. That is fascinating. Okay, very carry on. I just had to
The avoidance is a huge piece. And, with the avoidance, you see things like eating disorders, obviously things like self-harm, our avoidance, coping skills, substance use, sleeping all the time, being addicted to social media. All of those things I don't want to just sit with myself because then my mind starts to go. Dreams, nightmares, a lot of nightmares. People that have a lot of trauma tend to have a lot of sleep disturbances. So that's a red flag. Avoiding certain places or people or things, like I don't want to listen to that kind of music, or I don't want to smell that smell. I don't want to be in that part of town. A lot of times people are triggered by things and they don't even realize what's triggering them. Like it's like, oh, I just all of a sudden had a panic attack and I don't know why. And sometimes you can have panic attacks because your brain sort of hijacks you after a period of time of having a lot of anxiety. The brain kind of does that without you. a lot of times there's a trigger and people don't realize it. And when you help them think back and trace back, it can be something as just as simple as like a smell or a sound even. I was with a friend who has PTSD, and we were sitting out on the front porch, and there was a car, something or motorcycle that backfired and made a really loud sound. And this particular friend is a veteran. And so it obviously scared, he kind of took off like to see what it was. And then he was okay, seemingly okay. And then the next day he had kind of a decompensation. And so a lot of times too, like the trigger can happen and the reaction can be delayed somewhat. So looking for the triggers, negative beliefs about the world is a dangerous place. How did you come up with that? Some people just really accept that negative and that cognitive distortion as truth. And it can feel like truth to people that have had a lot of trauma. Difficulty connecting to other people. That can be kind of a way of protecting yourself. Like, I don't want to get hurt, so I'm going to, keep you at a distance. Obviously, hypervigilance. A lot of times I'll say, do you ever notice that like you don't like to sit with your back to the door? And people are like, oh, yeah, I do that. And they don't realize that can be a trauma response. Trouble with concentration, like we talked about, a lot of the diagnosis with ADHD can actually be a trauma response. I'm just operating from my reptilian brain and I can't really focus or concentrate because I can't access that part of my brain. So those are some things that I look for.
Something that I love about hearing these, one is I'm like, yes, that. But like so many of these I relate to.
Yeah.
And the reason that I love hearing those, it's not that I love that I relate to them, because quite frankly, I'm going to be honest. I was talking with my therapist earlier today, and he said he listens to this podcast, and he said, you talk, and I do. I've mentioned things about my mother frequently in the podcast, and he said, do you think your life would be different if you had a mother that loved you? And I was like, of course I would. So let's be clear. I'm not grateful that I relate to a lot of these things, but I do. And what I am grateful for is that in life, I have an example of, because I have been fortunate enough to work in treatment centers with individuals such as yourself who understood this link between childhood trauma and addiction. And they didn't just see me as someone coming in with self-harm, eating disorder, alcohol issues. They didn't just see that. They saw the underlying and they helped with that piece of it. And that was so critical. And because they did that, I had an example recently where in my paying job, I'm chief operating officer of a biotech company, and I was in a meeting and another executive blamed me for something that I didn't do and did this in front of everyone and called me out and was very aggressive. And I just reacted in my head, and I tried to remain calm because I am an executive, and remain calm. And I froze, and I felt in my body this reaction to it. And so I felt in my gut, my body temperature increased. I started to get a headache. So what I started doing, because of this realization and this therapy that I've had, is I started doing box breathing. I started feeling my fingertips and grounding my feet. And I decided I'm not going to react. But in that moment, I knew based on my body sensations, and because I had learned that those body sensations were sending me a message, I didn't react or overreact in that moment. But it wasn't in that moment that I realized why I was so upset. It was later that I realized that it reminded me in my childhood when my father used to do the exact same thing. And I used to not have the opportunity to defend myself and say, wait, I used to get blamed. That was just part of my childhood abuse. And it was maybe the next day that it suddenly occurred to me, that's why I was reacting in that moment. And it wasn't, this individual was not intentionally trying. This individual is a phenomenal human being. He was not intentionally trying to do that, but my body was reacting that way because I was receiving that input as if I was a 7-year-old girl receiving that, as if my father was saying that to me in front of my siblings. And that's how I was reacting to it. I share that story because if I had not gone through and had individuals who cared enough to help me heal or begin to heal, because I still have so much healing to do. If they had not done that, then I would have never been able to understand all of those dynamics. And I probably would just lost my shit and made a fool out of myself.
Yeah. Yeah. And you make such a great point about the substance use and the mental health. And I love that connection. And I kind of mentioned this earlier, but like we have tours come often and they're like, oh, it's so cool that you guys do mental health and substance use, because we only do substance use. And I'm like, I don't think that that's what you do, because I don't think you can have one without the other. And when you look at like AA, it is very based in cognitive behavior therapy. When you look at SMART recovery, it is cognitive behavior therapy. DBT is a set of skills to regulate your emotions and learn how to be mindful. So I don't think we can really separate those two things, but we still do that. A lot of people in our society do that. Like, oh, you use substances, or you have a substance use diagnosis, but it's really like, they're so integrated. I had the privilege to go a few years back to a facility, a mental health facility. It was their community mental health in Klamath Falls in Oregon. And we were taken there to see how they're doing things because it was very innovative. And I really wish that everybody would adopt this model. When they bring clients in, they don't even really worry so much about the diagnosis. What they want to know is, how much trauma have you had? And based on how much trauma you've had, that kind of plans your trajectory in their program. So, if you've had just a simple trauma, you may just get a few months of EMDR treatment. Whereas if you've had complex trauma, then, okay, we want to set you up with a peer and we want you doing some group DBT and, we want you doing yoga. And it's so beautiful. And it's kind of, I don't know if you're familiar with Oprah's book about what happened to you. And it's just based on the premise that as a society, we tend to ask this question of what's wrong with you instead of what happened to you. And I love that. Another thing that I just was thinking of when you were talking is because when you described the way you reacted in that situation, it made it sound, it's beautiful the way you were able to react, but I know that had to be a lot of work to get to that point. Like that takes so much practice, and it's not just learning the skills, it's applying the skills. And one of the things that I think sometimes we forget to really tell clients is when we're teaching them skills, they need to practice them when they're calm. So like, don't wait until you're in that moment when someone's triggering you to try to ground yourself and do the box breathing and, feel your fingertips. Because again, sometimes once you're triggered, you're operating in that reptilian brain and you can't really access those finer skills that you need. So you have to get up and have coffee every morning, and you have to practice the box breathing, and you have to practice the grounding, and you have to practice the things I can see, things I can feel touching me, things I can smell. And I think that that's one of the things that I'm constantly reminding my therapists is, as you're teaching these skills, remind the clients to practice it when they're calm, because it's so much more effective and you can access it.
I'm so glad you said that. So I did just briefly redo my ACE score. So I have an ACE score of 8 out of 10. And I've had a lot of people in my life say, how in the world have you had all the tragedies you've had and be so successful? I could never do that. Mm-hmm. And I've heard a couple of quotes that I think are so motivational. And one is, you don't know if you can lift a 10-pound weight until you have to lift a 10-pound weight. Mm-hmm. And so that is very much the case. But another one that I actually like even more, and the first time I heard this was, I'll give a plug for this podcast. I love the Motivated Mind podcast. So Scott is the host. It's the top 50 health podcast and over 300 episodes. And I'm super excited because he agreed to be a future guest on this podcast. But I love his episodes. They're phenomenal. And one of them, he really reiterates to not compare your chapter 1 to somebody else's chapter 10. And so what I want for listeners, if you just heard this and you think, wait, she has an A score of 8. I have an A score of 8. There's no way I could behave that way. I'm just going to give up. And I don't want that to be the reaction, because maybe listen back to episode 10 where I talk about I got kicked out of Blue Ridge because I did self-harm when I went in and I had no healthy coping mechanisms once the alcohol was taken away. And so I did self-harm and they sent me to the hospital, and then I had to beg my way back into the treatment center. And so I was in that boat and I just got lucky and was blessed to have individuals such as yourself who were at a center and a place who weren't just treating the addiction, but were treating the trauma. And that was the key to how I was able to slowly over 3 years get to where I could sit in that meeting and behave in that fashion. Because 3 years earlier, I absolutely would not have. 3 years earlier, I was getting kicked out of a treatment center because I had zero coping mechanisms. The minute I got surrounded by a whole bunch of men in a detox unit and I didn't have alcohol and I just had this kidnapping, I was doing self-harm. So don't compare your chapter 1 to somebody else's chapter 10. However, maybe, surround yourself with some people who have been in your chapter 1 and they're in chapter 10, and figure out those, like you said, those daily things that they've slowly learned how to do, and try and do those one step at a time. So I love those pieces of that. What is your most challenging part of your job? Now, this is probably hard. Working in the industry is very, very challenging. It is not for the faint of heart. I know that burnout is a big challenge in the industry. Maybe what are some of the things that you find most difficult, whether it is dealing with insurance, whether it's dealing with ignorance or lack of education, or whether it's dealing with struggling seeing individuals relapse and that internal struggle with that? Maybe talk about those types of struggles, and maybe specifically as it deals with understanding that trauma addiction link and how it kind of plays into this whole picture.
I think it depends on the day that you ask me what is the hardest part. I think the hardest part is probably something you just touched on, which is how we keep people safe, clients specifically. We know when we bring people in, they're not well, right? They don't have coping skills. They need help. A lot of times, if they're for substance use, we're taking away their primary coping skill. And so we know that there are going to be those moments of decompensation. And then you have some of the clients that may be on the spectrum. Maybe they're really high functioning on the spectrum. So the other community members look at them and think there's something wrong with them. And it can be very interesting because the community, the milieu, can sometimes be very judgmental of each other. And so you don't want to put the entire milieu at risk because you've got someone who's very disruptive and maybe not appropriate for your level of care. And we're kind of unique, I guess, in that we're subacute. So we're on 15, 20 acres and we don't have fences and we don't lock the doors and clients can come and go. And so if somebody's really suicidal or homicidal, we definitely refer them out. But there's always those clients that are kind of just, I can give you an example of, we had a client recently who got really upset and threw a chair and broke it. And it just really freaked everybody out. And there were a lot of threats of, well, if he's not leaving, then I'm not leaving. Like you need to discharge him. I don't feel safe. And so I think those are the hardest moments probably to make those calls, because that could be life or death for that one person that you're discharging. But it also, I've learned that sometimes you lose people if you can't provide a place where they feel safe with their cohort. So just making those decisions is probably consistently the hardest part of the job.
That makes complete sense. In my biotech company, it's a pancreatic cancer company. We're in a clinical trial on pancreatic cancer. We're recently talking about this. We have some subjects who end up not qualifying for the study. And we have this conversation about it's really hard to go and tell a patient you don't qualify. Mm-hmm. And I have to remind everyone, unfortunately, it's not just about that one patient. It's about getting this to be able to help so many more. And That never feels good. Never, ever, ever. Especially anyone who's in the line of work that we're both in, right? We're in this line of work to help others. And whenever you feel as if you can't help an individual, it doesn't feel good. So yeah, I can see how that would be a struggle.
Making those, sometimes it's really clear cut, and that's not difficult, but it's those that you're not sure about. Because I've made mistakes on both ends. I've kept someone there that in hindsight I probably shouldn't have kept, and I've let someone go that in hindsight I probably shouldn't have let go. So those are tough calls that you have to make weekly, if sometimes daily. So.
Well, I was grateful that they let me to get back into my treatment center, because it very much saved my life. And I pray that by saving my life and having the nonprofit that we now have in this podcast, that is helping others. And so I hope that it's now been a beautiful thing. But I know that and Joshua talks about it on episode 10. I think actually he talked about it afterwards, was that it was a big struggle for them to decide if they were going to let me back in, because I was a risk to them. And so I was grateful for that. If listeners may have listened to this so far and thought, okay, a couple of these things really stood out to me and I want to explore a little bit more, but I don't really know what to look for in a therapist or in a potential treatment center. What are some questions or I strongly believe you should interview your treatment centers. You should interview your therapist. This is like a collaboration. And it's kind of like dating. And if it doesn't work, you should just move on to the next. It's like no harm, no foul. It's what is going to work. So what are some things that the individual should look for to make sure that it's a good fit? Because it is a huge time commitment and financial commitment on both sides. So what are some of those things that listeners should look for, and specifically dealing to ones that are going to focus on the healing of the whole person and not just the addiction?
I think I would suggest asking for the curriculum so you can see exactly what groups you're going to be offered throughout the day. I personally would want a variety of things. I wouldn't want to be attending AA meetings all day. I wouldn't want to be doing yoga all day. I would want a variety of things to try so that I could figure out what works for me. One of the things I think is kind of hard to find is, I think when you're in like an inpatient setting, that 2 sessions with your therapist a week is a fair ask. A lot of places will only do 1. And if you're there 30 days, then that means you're detoxing for the first 7 days. You're not really going to get a good therapy session in. So you might have 3 therapy sessions. And I think we can do better than that. We try to get 2 sessions every week with our clients. I would probably ask what their philosophy is on trauma treatment while you're in residential, because a lot of places are kind of the opinion that we shouldn't open that door because you're only here 30 days and then we've opened that door and then we let you go. But if you can't do it when you're in residential treatment, I don't know when else you can do it. I think that's probably a lot of times the safest environment I mean, I would also caveat that with understanding that not everybody is actually ready for trauma treatment. Like they may want it, but they may not have the skills to do it. And we have to build those skills first, understanding if the place that you're looking at is open to that. If you have some skills in place and you can tolerate the trauma treatment, will they offer it? The level of care is important. Like if you know you have a tendency to self-harm or to have violent outbursts, you might need a little bit more of an acute level of care to keep you safe and to keep other people safe. Maybe you don't need inpatient treatment. Maybe you can go to IOP and go 3 days a week and still maintain a job and be with your family in the evenings. So the level of care, I think, is really important to look at. And other than that, just making sure if you want medicated assisted treatment that you're going to a place that offers that. You have to be open because it's not going to be perfect. I mean, it's inpatient treatment and it's not easy. It's not going to be easy. So you have to be kind of prepared for that part of it.
I love it. I, in my period of treatment, went to 3 different centers, and I really appreciated the ones that had diversity. And I started off with alcohol, then I went to what I call eating disorder camp, and then I went to what I call trauma camp for my debilitating nightmares. And I really appreciated the ones that had somatic body experience, opportunities, yoga, meditation. We had a Buddhist meditation. We had drumming affirmations or drumming intentions, like we talk about in episode 8. Also things like EMDR. And one of the things I like about centers that have these available is that you're there for a period of time. Let's just say you're there for 30 days. If you can at least try a couple of these modalities while you're there, because you said it very well a moment ago, what works for one individual is not necessarily going to work for another individual. So some of the somatic things for me, I'm so touch sensitive. I'm just not ready for that yet. But some of the other things really help. So it was able for me to say, okay, I can't do that yet. I tried it. And I flipped out. But because I was there, I could try all of those and I wasn't having to schedule them in the middle of work schedules and all of that. So having the diversity of those available to try while you're in a safe environment so that if you do struggle from it. So my experience with the somatic, I did have a bad experience from it and I was able to go and then meet with my therapist and be in a safe environment versus trying it for the first time in the quote unquote real world and then go back to the office and freak out in the office. So I love that in a center that you can do that. And then I also want to tie to, because I know that Ripple Ranch, or correct me if I'm wrong, I think you did say that you do have aftercare programs. So you do have an IOP, a PHP, a partial hospitalization, and IOP, so an intensive outpatient, and perhaps some other outpatient programs. I'm a big believer of trying to find programs that have those step down areas, because the idea that you can just go to a treatment center for a set period of time and then leave and be immediately healed and go back into, society and resume life is just not going to work in most cases. I think that trying to find a continuum of care and a transition plan and being thoughtful about what that looks like is really important.
Absolutely. Yeah. And a lot of places, the counselors are responsible for the case management, but we have our own case managers. And I think that's really important because that is a full-time job. I mean, there's a lot of evidence to support that the aftercare plan is one of the most important pieces of recovery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay, Crissy, so we're at the time for motivational quotes. What do you want to share with us today?
My favorite quote is very simple: lean into the discomfort.
Love that. Lean into the discomfort. I love that. Are there any parting words you want to make sure that the audience hears before we end today?
One of the potential questions was, what advice would you give to family members? And again, having been a family member myself, I think I have learned a lot about kind of what to do. And luckily, my daughter's come out the other side and she's doing beautifully. And so I'm definitely lucky. I would say first is just to love them unconditionally. Second is to set clear, firm boundaries and be prepared to stick with your boundaries. 3 would be start the process of looking for help, whether it's Al-Anon, some kind of family therapy for yourself, support in the community, kind of getting your footing so that you can start to build your resources and your support system. Last but not least is love them unconditionally. That's the most important.
Perfect. Couldn't have said it any better. Thank you so much for your time. This really means a lot.
Thank you.
You just listened to episode number 13, featuring our guest, Crissy Clark from Ripple Ranch Recovery, located in Spring Branch, Texas. In this episode, we discussed the link between childhood trauma and addiction. We walked through common types of childhood traumas, the role of coping mechanisms in the onset of addiction, and how therapy can address and heal past traumas. I particularly liked the emphasis on trying different treatment modalities until the individual in recovery finds the one that works for them. As a reminder, the experiences and advice expressed in this episode are the host and guest's own personal stories and advice and do not represent the opinions of any treatment center or organization mentioned. RAN is passionate about opening the doors for all voices and experiences, not just those expressed in any particular podcast. If you want to share your experiences or expertise, we encourage you to be a future guest by emailing us at podcast@recoveryadvocate.network.org or submit a blog post by emailing blog@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. In case you're wondering, every individual working with RAN does so on a 100% volunteer basis. All funds raised go to support the mission. So don't forget to love, not like, our podcast and subscribe. We have quite a few amazing guests booked for future episodes. Trust me, you won't want to miss them. So subscribe today. And by making sure that you give us an awesome rating and sharing our podcast with your friends and loved ones, then we are more likely to pop up when those who are in need are searching for a healing episode in their time of struggle. So take a moment and share this today. We hope you will also connect with us at www.recoveryadvocatenetwork.org, where you can donate to the mission, read our blog post, and stay in the loop about upcoming events, including our next fundraising auction on October 26th through the 28th of this year. If you would like a sneak peek into some available items, contact donate@recoveryadvocatenetwork.org. And if you would like to donate items or services, then email us. Make sure you follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Recovery Advocate Network and on Twitter at Ran to Wellness. If this episode was triggering to you, we encourage you to contact your support system, therapist, national and community support groups, the Global Crisis Text Line by texting 741-741, and/or, if in the United States, dialing 988 to reach the Suicide and Crisis Lifeline. If you're in the United States and need additional resources, such as shelter, support group resources, transportation, food, and/or a safe, confidential path out of physical and/or emotional domestic abuse, call 211 or visit www.211info.org for assistance. If you wish to provide feedback, please feel free to leave comments on the episode or email us. Now, back to your coffee.